Welcome, friend, to this gentle journey through the sands of time, where we'll explore one of history's most fascinating dynasties together. Tonight, we're traveling to ancient Egypt, but not the Egypt of the pharaohs you might expect. Instead, we'll discover the remarkable story of the Ptolemies, a Greek dynasty that ruled the land of the Nile for 3 centuries, transforming it into a center of learning and culture that would influence the world forever. Whether you're settling in for the night or simply seeking a peaceful escape from your day, I'm grateful you've chosen to spend this time with us. If this kind of immersive historical storytelling brings you comfort, consider subscribing for more journeys through the quiet corridors of the past. Picture yourself standing on the marble steps of the Great Library of Alexandria on a warm morning in 250 BCE. The Mediterranean breeze carries the scent of papyrus and ink as scholars from across the known world hurry past you, their arms filled with scrolls containing the wisdom of ages. This magnificent structure, rising like a temple to knowledge itself, represents the crown jewel of Ptolemaic Egypt. But to understand how this Greek dynasty came to rule the most ancient of kingdoms, we must first journey back to a dusty road in Babylon, where a young general named Ptolemy walked beside the greatest conqueror the world had ever known. The year was 323 billions CE, and Alexander the Great lay dying in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar. As his life ebbed away, his vast empire stretched from Macedonia to India, an impossible expanse for any single ruler to govern. Among the generals gathered around his deathbed was Ptolemys, son of Legus, a man whose calculating mind was already working through the implications of his king's imminent death. Unlike his more impetuous companions, Ptolemy had learned patience during his years serving Alexander. He understood that the greatest prizes often went not to the swiftest, but to the most thoughtful. When Alexander breathed his last, the empire he had built through conquest and charisma faced immediate dissolution. His generals, known to history as the Diadochi, began the complex process of dividing territories that would shape the Mediterranean world for centuries to come. In those tense negotiations, while others argued over Macedonia and Asia, Ptolemy quietly requested Egypt. His companions thought him modest, perhaps even foolish, for choosing what seemed like a distant backwater over the heartland of the empire. They could not have been more wrong. Ptolemy understood what others missed. Egypt was not merely another province, but a land apart, protected by deserts, blessed with the life-giving Nile, and possessed of wealth accumulated over 3 millennia of pharaonic rule. More importantly, it was a kingdom with clearly defined borders, unlike the sprawling territories his rivals would spend decades fighting to control. As he made his way down the ancient road to Memphis, Ptolemy was already envisioning a dynasty that would endure long after the other successor kingdoms had fallen. The Egypt that welcomed its new Macedonian ruler was a land of profound contradictions. Along the Nile, farmers continued their eternal rhythm of planting and harvesting as their ancestors had done since the time of the pyramids. In Memphis, the ancient capital, Egyptian priests maintained rituals that stretched back to the dawn of recorded history. Yet, this was also a land that had known foreign rule before. The Persians had governed Egypt for 2 centuries, and the people had learned to adapt while preserving their essential character. Ptolemy's first challenge was not military conquest, for Alexander had already secured Egypt's submission, but something far more complex: legitimacy. How could a Macedonian general convince the Egyptian people that he was their rightful pharaoh? The answer lay in understanding that Egyptian kingship was not merely political, but deeply religious. The pharaoh was not just a ruler, but a living god, the earthly embodiment of Horus and the son of Ra. In a stroke of genius that revealed his deep understanding of Egyptian culture, Ptolemy arranged for Alexander's body to be brought to Egypt for burial. This was no simple matter of honoring a fallen leader. In Egyptian belief, the presence of Alexander's remains would transfer divine legitimacy to the land itself, and by extension to its new ruler. The magnificent funeral procession that carried Alexander from Babylon to Egypt was one of the most spectacular displays the ancient world had ever seen, and it announced to all that Ptolemy was the true heir to the conqueror's legacy. But Ptolemy's masterstroke came in his approach to Egyptian religion and culture. Rather than imposing Greek customs wholesale, he presented himself as both pharaoh to his Egyptian subjects and king to his Greek settlers. In the great temple of Ptah at Memphis, he participated in the ancient coronation rituals that had made rulers legitimate for 3,000 years. Egyptian priests anointed him with sacred oils while reciting formulas in hieroglyphs that few Greeks could read. To his Egyptian subjects, he became Ptolemy I, beloved of Ptah, chosen of Ra, pharaoh of Upper and Lower Egypt. Yet in Alexandria, the great city that Alexander had founded at the mouth of the Nile, Ptolemy ruled as a Hellenistic king in the tradition of his Macedonian ancestors. Here, in palaces decorated with Greek columns and filled with Greek art, he held court according to the customs of his homeland. This dual identity would become the defining characteristic of Ptolemaic rule, allowing the dynasty to maintain legitimacy among both Greek and Egyptian populations for 3 centuries. The early years of Ptolemy's reign were marked by constant warfare as the successor kingdoms fought for dominance. From his palace in Alexandria, Ptolemy could hear reports of battles raging across the eastern Mediterranean. His rivals Antigonus and Seleucus carved up Alexander's Asian territories, while Cassander struggled to control Macedonia itself. Yet Egypt's natural defenses allowed Ptolemy to choose his battles carefully, intervening only when necessary to protect his borders or secure strategic advantages. During these tumultuous decades, daily life in Egypt gradually adapted to its new rulers. In the Delta region, Greek settlers established new towns with Greek names and Greek customs. These colonists, many of them veterans of Alexander's campaigns, brought with them the agricultural techniques and administrative practices of Macedonia. They cleared new land, introduced new crops, and established workshops that produced goods in Greek styles for Greek markets. Yet, the vast majority of Egypt's population remained Egyptian, living in villages along the Nile where the rhythms of life had changed little since pharaonic times. Each morning as the sun rose over the eastern desert, farmers would walk to their fields carrying the same tools their grandfathers had used. They planted wheat and barley when the Nile's floods receded, harvested grain under the scorching summer sun, and paid their taxes to officials who might now speak Greek, but who still demanded the same portion of the crop that pharaohs, tax collectors, had always required. In the great cities, the fusion of Greek and Egyptian cultures created something entirely new. Memphis, the ancient capital, became a cosmopolitan center where Egyptian merchants conducted business with Greek traders in multiple languages. The city's markets overflowed with goods from across the Mediterranean, wine from the Greek islands, purple dye from Phoenicia, ivory from Nubia, and spices from Arabia. Egyptian artisans adapted their traditional techniques to create objects that appealed to Greek tastes, while Greek artists learned to work with Egyptian materials and motifs. Perhaps nowhere was this cultural fusion more apparent than in religion. Ptolemy understood that he could not simply replace Egyptian gods with Greek ones without risking rebellion. Instead, he promoted a syncretic approach that identified Egyptian deities with Greek counterparts. Amun-Ra became associated with Zeus, Hathor with Aphrodite, and Thoth with Hermes. This religious diplomacy reached its culmination in Ptolemy's creation of an entirely new god, Serapis. Serapis was designed to appeal to both Greek and Egyptian sensibilities. His cult combined elements of the Egyptian god Osiris with attributes of Greek deities like Zeus and Dionysus. The magnificent Capium in Alexandria became one of the most important religious centers in the Mediterranean world, attracting pilgrims and worshippers from dozens of different cultures. This religious innovation demonstrated Ptolemy's sophisticated understanding that successful rule required not just military power but cultural creativity. The prosperity that resulted from this careful balance between tradition and innovation was remarkable. Egypt under the earlies became the wealthiest kingdom in the Mediterranean world. The Nile's annual flood continued to provide the agricultural abundance that had made Egypt rich for millennia. But now that wealth was enhanced by Greek commercial networks and administrative efficiency, trade routes that had once carried Egyptian goods only to Nubia and the Levant now extended to Sicily, Spain, and the Black Sea. In Alexandria, the profits from this expanded trade funded projects that would make the city legenda. Rai, the great library begun under Ptolemy I and completed under his son, represented an unprecedented attempt to collect all human knowledge in one place. Scholars working in the library's halls could consult texts on mathematics from Babylon, poetry from Athens, medical treatises from Sicily, and astronomical observations from India. The Pharos Lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, guided ships carrying this diverse cargo safely into Alexandria's harbor. Yet beneath this glittering surface of prosperity and cultural achievement, tensions simmered that would eventually contribute to the dynasty's downfall. The Ptolemies' dual identity as both Greek kings and Egyptian pharaohs required constant balancing that became more difficult with each generation. Egyptian priests, while publicly supportive of their Greek rulers, privately maintained traditions and loyalties that connected them to Egypt's pharaonic past. Greek settlers, meanwhile, often viewed themselves as a superior class destined to rule over the native population. These cultural tensions were compounded by the Ptolemies' peculiar marriage customs. Following the example of the pharaohs, Ptolemaic rulers began marrying their sisters to preserve the purity of their bloodline and concentrate power within the royal family. While this practice was accepted in Egyptian tradition, it created dynastical complications that would plague later generations. Court intrigue, sibling rivalry, and succession disputes became constant features of Ptolemaic rule. As the first Ptolemy aged, he could look back on remarkable achievements. He had transformed a fragment of Alexander's empire into a stable, prosperous kingdom that had successfully defended itself against all challenges. Alexandria had become one of the great cities of the world, rivaling Athens and Rome in importance. Egyptian grain fed much of the Mediterranean, while Egyptian gold and luxury goods enriched trade networks from Spain to India. The morning sun that rose over Alexandria in 283 BCE illuminated a city that embodied the cosmopolitan spirit of the Hellenistic age. In the harbor, ships from dozens of nations unloaded cargo while their crews marveled at the towering lighthouse. In the palace district, courtiers speaking Greek, Egyptian, and a dozen other languages navigated the complex protocols of royal administration. And in the library, scholars pursued questions about mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy that would influence human thought for centuries to come. This was the world that Ptolemy I created through patient calculation, cultural sensitivity, and administrative genius. Yet, as he prepared to pass his throne to his son, he could not have foreseen how the very success of his innovations would create new challenges for future generations. The wealth and power he had accumulated would make the Ptolemaic kingdom a target for ambitious rivals, while the cultural synthesis he had achieved would prove increasingly difficult to maintain as Greek and Egyptian identities pulled in different directions. The story of how this remarkable dynasty navigated these challenges reached the heights of power under rulers like Ptolemy III and the legendary Cleopatra II, and ultimately succumbed to the rising power bar, Rome, would unfold over the next 3 centuries in a drama of ambition, brilliance, and tragedy that rivals any tale from the ancient world. The Reign Ptolemy. The Second Philadelphia began in 283 BCE with challenges that would have broken a lesser man. At 25, he inherited not just a throne, but the delicate balance his father had spent decades perfecting between Greek ambition and Egyptian tradition. The young king understood that his legitimacy depended not on the blood in his veins, but on his ability to continue the careful dance between two worlds that often seemed irreconcilable. In the pre-dawn hours of a typical morning in Alexandria, Ptolemy II would rise before the sun painted the eastern sky pink over Lake Marotus. His private chambers, decorated with both Greek marble and Egyptian granite, reflected the dual nature of his kingdom. Egyptian servants, their movements silent as shadows, would prepare his morning meal, while Greek bodyguards took their positions outside his door. The king's day began not with royal ceremony, but with correspondence that arrived from every corner of the Mediterranean world. By the time most of his subjects began stirring, Ptolemy II was already deep in consultation with his advisors, reviewing reports from provincial governors who administered a kingdom that stretched from the first cataract of the Nile to the bustling ports of Cyrene. The morning briefings revealed the constant complexity of ruling a land where Greek settlers in newly founded cities lived alongside Egyptian farmers, whose families had worked the same fields since the time of the pyramids. The young king's greatest innovation lay in his understanding that prosperity required not just maintaining his father's achievements, but expanding them, where Ptolemy I had been content to secure Egypt's borders and establish its independence. His son envisioned a kingdom that would dominate the eastern Mediterranean through trade, culture, and strategic alliances rather than conquest alone. This vision would transform Egypt from a regional power into the center of the Hellenistic world. The expansion of Alexandria's great library under Ptolemy II became the most visible symbol of this ambitious program. The king personally recruited scholars from Athens, Rhodes, and Syracuse, offering them not just generous salaries but access to resources no other ruler could provide. In the library's expanded halls, mathematicians like Euclid developed geometric principles that students would study 2 millennia later, while geographers attempted to map the known world with unprecedented accuracy. Yet, this intellectual flowering required enormous wealth to sustain, and Ptolemy II proved as innovative in generating revenue as he was in spending it. The king's administrators developed new agricultural techniques that increased crop yields throughout the Nile Valley. They introduced improved irrigation systems that brought previously barren land under cultivation, while standardizing weights and measures to facilitate trade across the kingdom's diverse regions. The daily life of ordinary Egyptians during this period reflected both continuity with ancient traditions and adaptation to new opportunities. In villages throughout Upper Egypt, farmers continued to plant their fields according to the Nile's eternal rhythm. But now they might also grow new crops introduced by Greek settlers, or sell their surplus grain to merchants who shipped it to distant markets in Sicily or the Black Sea. In Memphis, the ancient capital that remained Egypt's religious heart, Egyptian priests maintained temples that had stood for thousands of years while also participating in the new religious synthesis that characterized Ptolemaic rule. The morning rituals in the great temple of Ptah followed formulas carved in hieroglyphs on walls that predated Greek civilization. Yet the same priests who performed these ancient ceremonies might spend their afternoons discussing philosophy with visiting scholars from the Library of Alexandria. The marketplace of Memphis during Ptolemy II's reign would have overwhelmed visitors from previous centuries with its diversity and abundance. Egyptian merchants hawked traditional goods like linen, papyrus, and gold, jewelry alongside Greek pottery, Phoenician glacier, and Indian spices. The languages of commerce included not just Egyptian and Greek, but Aramaic, Hebrew, and various dialects from across the Mediterranean world. This cosmopolitan atmosphere extended to Alexandria, where the fusion of cultures created entirely new forms of art and literature. Greek poets living in the city began incorporating Egyptian themes and imagery into their work, while Egyptian artists learned to sculpt in Greek styles. The result was a cultural synthesis that was neither purely Greek nor purely Egyptian, but something uniquely Ptolemaic. The royal court itself embodied this cultural fusion. Ptolemy II's marriage to his sister Arsinoe, II, following Egyptian pharaonic tradition, scandalized Greek public opinion, but was accepted by Egyptian subjects as natural and proper for divine rulers. The queen's influence extended far beyond ceremonial roles. She actively participated in diplomatic negotiations and administrative decisions, following precedents set by powerful Egyptian queens like Hatshepsut and Nefertiti. Daily court ceremonies blended Greek and Egyptian elements in ways that reinforced the dynasty's dual legitimacy. Mourning. Audiences might begin with Greek-style presentations from foreign ambassadors, continue with Egyptian-style petitions from native officials, and conclude with religious observances that honored both Greek and Egyptian deities. These elaborate protocols required constant attention to detail, as any perceived slight to either cultural tradition could trigger political complications. The economic policies developed during Ptolemy II's reign demonstrated remarkable sophistication in managing a kingdom that encompassed diverse populations and geographic regions. The king's administrators established a royal monopoly on key industries like oil production and textile manufacturing, ensuring steady revenue streams while providing employment for thousands of workers. He state enterprises operated alongside private businesses that continued traditional crafts and trades. Agriculture remained the foundation of Egypt's prosperity, but Ptolemy II's innovations expanded agricultural production beyond anything achieved under previous rulers. Royal engineers improved the irrigation systems that channeled Nile flood waters to distant fields, while agricultural experts experimented with new varieties of wheat and barley that could thrive in different soil conditions. The result was surplus production that fed not just Egypt's growing population, but also provided exports that generated enormous wealth. The administration of this complex economy required bureaucratic innovations that influenced governmental practices throughout the ancient world. Ptolemaic officials developed detailed record-keeping systems that tracked everything from individual tax payments to the inventory of royal warehouses. These administrative practices, recorded on thousands of papyrus documents that archaeologists continue to discover, reveal the extraordinary attention to detail that characterized governance. Military affairs under Ptolemy II reflected the kingdom's strategic position at the crossroads of Africa, Asia, and Europe. The king maintained a navy that dominated the eastern Mediterranean, while also supporting land forces that could defend Egypt's borders against potential threats from the Seleucid Empire to the east and emerging Roman power to the west. The integration of Greek military techniques with Egyptian resources created armed forces that were both professionally competent and financially sustainable. The daily routine of Ptolemaic soldiers stationed at frontier posts like Syene near the First Cataract involved not just military duties but also administrative responsibilities that reflected the kingdom's sophisticated approach to border management. These soldiers collected customs duties from Nubian traders, maintained communication networks that connected distant outposts with Alexandria, and served as the kingdom's representatives to local populations that included Egyptians, Nubians, and various nomadic tribes. Religious life throughout the kingdom during this period demonstrated the remarkable success of Ptolemaic cultural policies. In temples from the Mediterranean coast to the southern frontier, Egyptian priests performed traditional ceremonies while also participating in new religious festivals that honored both Egyptian and Greek deities. The cult of Serapis, established by Ptolemy I, reached its full flowering under his son, attracting worshippers from throughout the Mediterranean world to its magnificent temple in Alexandria. The philosophical and scientific achievements of the Alexandrian scholars during Ptolemy II's reign established intellectual traditions that would influence Western thought for centuries. Aristarchus of Samos proposed that the Earth revolved around the sun, anticipating Copernican astronomy by 18th centuries. Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy, while Apollonius of Perga developed mathematical concepts that would later prove essential to understanding orbital mechanics. These intellectual achievements were not merely abstract exercises but had practical applications that improved daily life throughout the kingdom. Improved understanding of astronomy led to more accurate calendars that helped farmers plan their planting and harvesting. Advances in engineering enabled the construction of better irrigation systems and more efficient machines for processing agricultural products. Medical knowledge preserved in the library's collections helped physicians throughout the Mediterranean world treat diseases more effectively. The prosperity and cultural achievement of Egypt under Ptolemies II attracted attention from rulers throughout the ancient world, but it also generated envy and suspicion that would create future challenges for the dynasty. The kingdom's wealth made it an attractive target for ambitious rivals, while its cultural innovations sometimes threatened traditional power structures in other Hellenistic kingdoms. As the sun set over Alexandria on a typical evening during the height of Ptolemy II's reign, the city's harbour would be crowded with ships from dozens of nations. Merchants from Athens discussed business deals with Egyptian traders, while scholars from the library debated philosophical questions in the city's famous gymnasia. The lighthouse guided vessels safely to port, while its lights symbolized the intellectual illumination that emanated from the kingdom's capital. This was the golden age of Ptolemaic Egypt, when the careful balance between Greek innovation and Egyptian tradition created a civilization that combined the best elements of both cultures. Yet beneath this glittering surface, forces were already at work that would eventually challenge the dynasty's ability to maintain its remarkable synthesis of diverse traditions and competing interests. The Third Syrian War that erupted in 246 C would test every diplomatic skill and military strategy the Ptolemies had developed over 2 generations. When Ptolemy III Oegates ascended the throne, he inherited not just his father's prosperous kingdom, but also a complex web of alliances and rivalries that stretched across the eastern Mediterranean. The young king's sister, Bones, had married the Seleucid ruler Antiochus II, but when her husband died, under suspicious circumstances, and she was murdered along with her infant son, Ptolemy III, faced a choice that would define his reign. The morning that news of his sister's death reached Alexandria, Ptolemy III stood in the palace courtyard, watching the sun rise over a city that had known peace and prosperity for decades. Egyptian gardeners tended exotic plants collected from across the known world, while Greek architects discussed plans for new monuments that would celebrate the kingdom's achievements. Yet, the king understood that this tranquil scene might soon be shattered by the drums of war. The decision to launch a massive military expedition to avenge Bren's murder and secure her son's inheritance transformed Egypt from a primarily defensive kingdom into an aggressive imperial power. For the first time since Alexander's conquests, Egyptian armies would march beyond the traditional borders of the Nile Valley to claim territories that stretched from the Iron Sea to the borders of India. In the weeks that followed the declaration of war, Alexandria became a hive of military preparation that revealed the kingdom's remarkable organizational capabilities. Egyptian shipwrights worked alongside Greek naval architects to expand the royal fleet, while armorers produced weapons that combined traditional Egyptian craftsmanship with the latest Greek military technology. The city's warehouses overflowed with supplies destined for an expedition that would require logistical coordination on an unprecedented scale. The common soldiers who would fight in this campaign came from every corner of the kingdom. Egyptian farmers temporarily abandoned their fields to serve in infantry units that had protected the Nile Valley for generations. Greek settlers from the Delta cities joined cavalry regiments that maintained the military traditions of Macedonia. Nubian warriors brought skills in desert warfare that would prove invaluable during the long marches through Syrian territory. As Ptolemy III's armies advanced into Syria, they encountered cities that had known Greek rule for generations, but had never experienced the particular blend of Greek efficiency and Egyptian wealth that characterized Ptolemaic administration. Damascus opened its gates without resistance when the Egyptian king demonstrated that he came not as a conqueror seeking plunder, but as a liberator offering the prosperity and cultural sophistication that had made Alexandria the envy of the Mediterranean world. The daily routine of Egyptian soldiers during this campaign reflected the kingdom's approach to imperial expansion. Unlike the brutal conquest methods employed by earlier conquerors, Ptolemaic forces established administrative systems in captured territories that respected local customs, while introducing the economic innovations that had generated Egypt's prosperity. Egyptian scribes worked alongside Syrian officials to establish tax systems that were both efficient and fair, while Greek engineers began construction projects that would improve local infrastructure. In Babylon, the ancient capital that had once been the seat of Alexander's empire, Ptolemy III performed ceremonies that proclaimed him the legitimate heir to the great conqueror's legacy. Egyptian priests accompanied the king to participate in rituals that honored both Mesopotamian traditions and the religious synthesis that characterized Ptolemaic rule. The sight of Egyptian pharaonic regalia in the palace where Alexander had died created a powerful symbol of cultural continuity that impressed local populations. The military successes of the Third Syrian War brought enormous wealth flowing into Egypt's royal treasury. Captured silver from Persian treasuries supplemented the gold mines of Nubia, while tribute from conquered cities provided resources that funded even more ambitious construction projects in Alexandria. The Great Library's collection expanded to include texts captured from the ancient libraries of Babylon and Susa, making it truly the repository of all human knowledge. Yet these triumphs came at a cost that would influence Ptolemaic policy for generations. The kingdom's military resources were stretched across territories that extended from the cataracts of the Nile to the mountains of Anatolia, requiring administrative innovations that gradually transformed Egypt's traditional governmental structures. Provincial governors who had once managed purely Egyptian territories now oversaw diverse populations that included Greeks, Syrians, Jews, Persians, and dozens of other ethnic groups. The daily correspondence that reached Ptolemy III's court during this period revealed the complexity of governing an empire that encompassed such diverse territories and populations. Reports from Egyptian administrators in the Nile Valley described traditional concerns about flood levels and crop yields, while dispatches from Syrian governors dealt with theological disputes between different Christian sects and commercial conflicts between competing merchant guilds. In Memphis, the ancient capital that remained Egypt's spiritual heart, priests maintained traditional ceremonies while also adapting their rituals to acknowledge the kingdom's expanded territorial reach. The morning offerings in the Temple of Ptah included prayers for the safety of Egyptian armies fighting in distant lands, while evening ceremonies gave thanks for victories that had brought honor to the pharaoh and prosperity to his people. The cultural impact of these military successes extended far beyond political boundaries to influence artistic and intellectual developments throughout the Ptolemaic kingdom. Greek poets in Alexandria composed epic verses celebrating the king's achievements, while Egyptian artists created sculptures and paintings that depicted the pharaoh as both a Greek hero and an Egyptian god. This artistic synthesis reflected the growing confidence of a dynasty that had successfully combined two great civilizations. The wealth generated by military conquest enabled Ptolemy III to undertake construction projects that surpassed even the achievements of his predecessors. The expansion of Alexandria's harbor included new lighthouse facilities that could guide larger numbers of ships, carrying tribute and trade goods from across the expanded empire. The palace complex grew to accommodate diplomatic missions from dozens of kingdoms that now sought alliance with the most powerful ruler in the eastern Mediterranean. Egyptian merchants during this golden age enjoyed trading opportunities that would have been unimaginable to their ancestors. Commercial networks that had once connected the Nile Valley with Nubia and the Levant now extended to the Black Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the distant kingdoms of Central Asia. Egyptian linen appeared in markets from Spain to India, while exotic goods from across the known world filled Alexandria's warehouses. The administrative challenges of governing this expanded empire required innovations that influenced governmental practices throughout the ancient world. Ptolemaic officials developed communication systems that could coordinate policy across thousands of miles, while creating standardized legal codes that could be applied fairly to diverse populations with different cultural traditions and religious beliefs. Yet, even as Egypt reached the height of its power and prosperity, internal tensions were developing that would eventually threaten the dynasty's stability. The costs of maintaining armies in distant territories strained even abundant resources, while the cultural synthesis that had been the source of Ptolemaic strength became increasingly difficult to maintain as Greek and Egyptian identities evolved in different directions. The priests in Egyptian temples, while publicly supportive of Greek rulers, privately began to question whether Pharaoh's attention to foreign conquests was diverting resources from the traditional responsibilities of Egyptian kingship. Greek settlers in Alexandria, meanwhile, sometimes resented the taxes required to fund military campaigns that brought glory to the dynasty, but seemed to offer little direct benefit to their daily lives. In the palace workshops where royal artisans created the magnificent objects that proclaimed Ptolemaic power and sophistication, craftsmen worked with materials gathered from every corner of the known world. Indian pearls were set in gold mine in Nubia, while Syrian silver was shaped by techniques passed down through generations of Egyptian metal workers. These luxury goods served not just as symbols of royal wealth, but as diplomatic gifts that maintained the complex alliance networks essential to imperial administration. The intellectual achievements of Alexandrian scholars during this period built upon the foundations established by earlier generations while addressing new questions raised by the kingdom's expanded geographical and cultural horizons. Geographers attempted to map territories that Egyptian armies had reached for the first time, while historians chronicled the achievements of a dynasty that had transformed a regional kingdom into a Mediterranean empire. As winter approached in 241 BCE, Ptolemy III could survey achievements that rivaled those of Alexander himself. Egyptian control extended from the sources of the Nile to the shores of the Iron Sea. While Alexandria had become the undisputed center of learning and culture in the ancient world, the king's morning audiences included ambassadors from Rome and Carthage, kingdoms that were beginning to recognize Egypt as a major factor in Mediterranean politics. Yet the wise king understood that military conquest was easier than imperial administration, and that the true test of his achievements would come in the peaceful decades that followed. The wealth and territory he had gained would need to be consolidated through careful diplomacy and administrative innovation if the Ptolemaic dynasty was to maintain its position as the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean. The evening prayers in Alexandria's temples on that winter night in 241 BCE included gratitude for victories achieved and requests for wisdom to govern justly the diverse peoples who now looked to the pharaoh for protection and prosperity. The priests who offered these prayers spoke in ancient Egyptian formulas that connected the present moment to 3 millennia of pharaonic tradition, while also acknowledging the Greek innovations that had made their kingdom the wonder of the contemporary world. This was the moment when Ptolemaic Egypt reached its greatest territorial extent and cultural influence, when the careful balance between tradition and innovation that had characterized the dynasty since its founding achieved its most spectacular success. Yet even in this hour of triumph, the seeds of future challenges were already taking root in the very complexity of the empire that Ptolemy III had created. Ptolemy III had created the prosperity that followed the Third Syrian War, created an Egypt that even seasoned travelers found difficult to comprehend. In the royal quarters of Alexandria, Ptolemy III would begin each day reviewing reports that arrived by swift messenger from territories spanning 3 continents. The papyrus scrolls spread across his marble desk chronicled tax collections from Syrian cities, tribute payments from Iron Islands, and trade negotiations with kingdoms so distant their names were barely known to earlier generations of Egyptian rulers. In the harbor below the palace, ships arrived, hourly, carrying the wealth of empire. Phoenician vessels unloaded purple dyes and cedarwood while Indian merchants displayed precious stones that caught the morning light like captured rainbows. The dock workers who hauled these treasures spoke a dozen different languages, yet all understood the universal tongue of commerce that made Alexandria the beating heart of Mediterranean trade. The daily life of ordinary Alexandrians during this golden age reflected opportunities their grandparents could never have imagined. Egyptian artisans found ready markets for goods that incorporated designs and techniques learned from Syrian craftsmen and Mesopotamian metalworkers. A potter might begin his morning creating traditional Egyptian vessels, spend his afternoon teaching Greek students the secrets of glazing techniques, and end his day collaborating with Phoenician merchants on designs for export markets in distant Spain. In the residential quarters, where Greek settlers had established their families, households blended traditions that would have seemed incompatible to earlier generations. Children learned to read Egyptian hieroglyphs alongside Greek letters, while their mothers adapted traditional Macedonian recipes to incorporate spices brought by traders from Arabia and India. The morning meal in a prosperous Greek household might include Egyptian bread, Nubian dates, Syrian wine, and honey from the hills of Attica. Yet beneath this cosmopolitan prosperity, careful observers could detect subtle tensions that would eventually challenge the dynasty's remarkable synthesis. In the Egyptian quarters of Memphis and Thebes, priests continued their ancient rituals while privately questioning whether Pharaoh's attention to foreign territories was weakening his connection to the sacred duties that had sustained Egypt for millennia. The morning offerings in temple sanctuaries followed formulas that emphasized Pharaoh's responsibility to maintain Mahat, the cosmic order that required constant attention to the Nile's floods, the people's welfare, and the gods' favor. The wealth flowing from conquered territories enabled construction, projects that transformed Egypt's landscape in unprecedented ways. In Alexandria, the royal architects designed new quarters that could accommodate the growing population of foreign residents, while maintaining the city's distinctive character. The morning sounds that echoed through these expanding neighborhoods included the hammers of Syrian stonemasons, the chisels of Greek sculptors, and the chants of Egyptian work crews hauling massive granite blocks from distant quarries. The Great Library's expansion during this period created the ancient world's most ambitious center of learning and research. Scholars arriving from conquered territories brought with them not just their personal knowledge, but access to entire libraries that had been accumulated over centuries in cities like Babylon, Damascus, and Antioch. The morning sessions in the library lecture halls might feature a Mesopotamian astronomer explaining Babylonian mathematical techniques to Greek students, while Egyptian physicians demonstrated surgical procedures to Syrian medical practitioners. Administrative innovation became essential as the kingdom's bureaucracy struggled to manage territories that presented unprecedented challenges. In the palace archives, scribes developed new record-keeping systems that could track tax obligations from Syrian farming villages, tribute payments from Aeaean merchant cities, and military service requirements from Nubian frontier settlements. The daily correspondence that moved through these administrative networks required translation into multiple languages and adaptation to diverse legal traditions. The military forces that protected this expanded empire reflected the kingdom's remarkable diversity, while maintaining the professional standards that had made Egyptian armies victorious across 3 continents. In frontier garrisons from the Euphrates to the Nubian desert, Egyptian officers commanded units that included Greek cavalry, Syrian infantry, Nubian archers, and Arab scouts. The morning drills in these distant posts followed Macedonian military procedures while incorporating tactical innovations learned through combat experience in diverse terrains. Religious life throughout the kingdom demonstrated the continuing evolution of the cultural synthesis that had characterized Ptolemaic rule since its inception. In temples from Alexandria to Aswan, priests performed ceremonies that honored traditional Egyptian deities while acknowledging the expanded geographical reach of Pharaoh's authority. The daily rituals included prayers for the safety of Egyptian armies in distant lands and thanksgiving for victories that had brought honor to the gods and prosperity to their people. The economic policies developed during this period of maximum expansion revealed the sophisticated understanding that Ptolemaic administrators had developed regarding the management of diverse populations and resources. Royal monopolies on key industries like papyrus production and precious metal mining generated steady revenue streams, while providing employment for workers throughout the kingdom. These state enterprises operated alongside private businesses that continued traditional crafts while also experimenting with new techniques learned from foreign craftsmen. Agricultural innovation remained crucial to sustaining the kingdom's expanded population and military commitments. In the Nile Valley, Egyptian farmers experimented with new irrigation techniques that could increase crop yields while also growing exotic plants brought from conquered territories. The morning work in these experimental fields involved careful observation of soil conditions, water requirements, and seasonal patterns that might enable cultivation of Syrian grapes, Mesopotamian grains, and Anatolian fruits in Egyptian conditions. The royal court itself became a showcase of the cultural fusion that characterized Ptolemaic Egypt at its zenith. Daily ceremonies blended Egyptian pharaonic traditions with Greek royal protocols, while incorporating elements from the diverse kingdoms that now acknowledged Egyptian supremacy. Foreign ambassadors presenting tribute might participate in ancient Egyptian rituals that proclaimed Pharaoh's divine authority while also engaging in Greek-style diplomatic negotiations that reflected contemporary international practices. Maritime commerce reached levels that strained even Alexandria's expanded harbor facilities. The morning arrival of merchant fleets required coordination between Egyptian port officials, Greek shipping agents, and foreign trading representatives who conducted business according to commercial laws that had evolved to accommodate the diverse legal traditions of the Mediterranean world. These bustling docks processed goods that traveled thousands of miles, while also serving as information exchanges where news from across the known world reached Egyptian administrators within weeks of distant events. The artistic achievements of this golden age reflected the confident synthesis of traditions that had made Ptolemaic culture distinctive throughout the Mediterranean world. In royal workshops, Egyptian craftsmen worked with Syrian goldsmiths to create ceremonial objects that incorporated design elements from multiple traditions while maintaining the distinctive aesthetic that proclaimed Ptolemaic sophistication. The daily activities in these workshops involved constant innovation as artists experimented with new techniques and materials brought from conquered territories. Educational institutions throughout the kingdom adapted their curricula to prepare students for careers in an empire that spanned multiple continents and cultures. In Alexandria's schools, young Greeks learned Egyptian history and religious traditions, while Egyptian students studied Greek philosophy and military tactics. The morning lessons in these diverse classrooms created the intellectual foundations for a generation that would need to navigate the complex cultural and political landscape of Ptolemaic imperial administration. Yet even as Egypt enjoyed unprecedented prosperity and international prestige, wise observers could recognize signs of potential instability that would challenge future generations. The costs of maintaining armies in distant territories strained even Egypt's abundant resources, while the cultural diversity that had been a source of strength also created administrative complexities that required constant attention and innovation to manage effectively. The daily routines of provincial governors throughout the empire revealed the enormous challenges involved in governing territories that encompassed dozens of different ethnic groups, religious traditions, and economic systems. A typical morning in Damascus might involve mediating disputes between Syrian merchants and Egyptian tax collectors, while afternoon sessions addressed conflicts between local religious authorities and Ptolemaic cultural policies. In the palace libraries, where royal scholars compiled the administrative manuals that guided imperial governance, researchers developed new approaches to law, taxation, and cultural integration that would influence governmental practices throughout the ancient world. These detailed studies of comparative administration reflected the Ptolemaic understanding that successful empire required not just military conquest, but sophisticated institutional development that could adapt to diverse local conditions. The evening ceremonies in Alexandria's temples during the height of Ptolemy III's reign included prayers of gratitude for achievements that had elevated Egypt to unprecedented heights of power and prosperity. Yet these same prayers also requested divine guidance for the complex challenges that would face future generations as they attempted to maintain the remarkable synthesis of cultures and territories that had made the Ptolemaic kingdom the wonder of the contemporary world. The legacy that Ptolemy III would leave to his successors included not just vast territories and enormous wealth, but also the administrative innovations and cultural achievements that had transformed Egypt from a regional kingdom into the center of Mediterranean civilization. The young prince, who would eventually inherit this magnificent empire, would also inherit the responsibility for preserving the delicate balance of traditions and interests that had made Ptolemaic success possible, while adapting to new challenges that would test every aspect of the dynasty's remarkable achievements. As the stars appeared over Alexandria's harbor on those glorious nights when Egyptian power reached its zenith, the lighthouse beams swept across waters crowded with ships from every corner of the known world. The light that guided these vessels safely to port also symbolized the intellectual and cultural illumination that emanated from a kingdom where Egyptian wisdom and Greek innovation had created something entirely new in human history. A civilization that honored ancient traditions while embracing the possibilities of an interconnected world. The reign of Ptolemy IV Philopator marked a turning point, where the very success of his predecessors began to create challenges that no amount of wealth or cultural sophistication could easily resolve. When he ascended the throne in 221 BCE, the young king inherited an empire that stretched across 3 continents, but he also inherited the enormous costs and administrative complexities that such vast territories demanded. In the royal apartments of Alexandria, Ptolemy IV would awaken each morning to find his chambers filled with the scent of incense imported from distant Punt and the sound of Syrian musicians playing melodies that blended Egyptian rhythms with Greek harmonies. Yet beneath this luxurious facade, the daily briefings that began his day revealed mounting pressures that would test the dynasty's foundations in ways his ancestors had never experienced. The morning reports that reached the king's desk chronicled challenges that spanned from the temples of Thebes to the trading posts of the Red Sea. Egyptian priests complained that royal attention to foreign territories was neglecting the sacred duties that had sustained pharaonic rule for 3 millennia. Greek settlers in newly conquered Syrian cities demanded protection from local populations who resented foreign rule. Nubian gold mines required constant military protection against tribal raids that threatened one of the kingdom's most vital revenue sources. In Alexandria's harbor, the daily arrival of tribute ships created scenes of unprecedented abundance that masked growing financial strains. While precious goods continued to flow into Egyptian warehouses, the costs of maintaining garrisons across the Mediterranean and administering diverse populations with conflicting legal traditions consumed resources faster than even Egypt's legendary wealth could sustain. The morning activities of royal accountants involved increasingly complex calculations to balance military expenses against declining agricultural revenues caused by irregular Nile floods. The cultural fusion that had been the hallmark of Ptolemaic success began showing signs of strain as different populations within the empire developed competing visions of their relationship to Egyptian rule. In Memphis, Egyptian artisans created magnificent works that proclaimed Pharaoh's divine authority according to traditions that stretched back to the pyramids. Yet in Alexandria, Greek intellectuals debated philosophical questions about the nature of legitimate government that sometimes challenged the very foundations of monarchical rule. Daily life in the palace reflected these underlying tensions through subtle changes in ceremonial protocols and administrative procedures. The morning audiences that had once seamlessly blended Egyptian and Greek traditions now required careful choreography to prevent cultural misunderstandings that might escalate into political conflicts. Foreign ambassadors presenting tribute needed instruction in both Egyptian religious symbolism and Greek diplomatic customs to avoid inadvertent slights that could disrupt delicate international relationships. The Great Library continued to attract scholars from across the known world, but their research increasingly focused on practical problems of imperial administration rather than the pure intellectual pursuits that had characterized earlier generations. In the morning seminars, where Egyptian priests discussed theological questions with Greek philosophers, conversations often turned to urgent matters of taxation policy, military recruitment, and legal codification that reflected the empire's growing administrative complexity. Military affairs during Ptolemy IV's reign revealed the challenges of maintaining professional forces across territories that presented vastly different strategic requirements. Egyptian soldiers stationed in Syrian frontier posts adapted their traditional tactics to address threats from nomadic raiders whose mobility and local knowledge gave them advantages that conventional military training could not easily counter. The daily routines of these distant garrisons involved not just military duties, but also diplomatic responsibilities, as soldiers served as the kingdom's primary representatives to populations that remained suspicious of foreign rule. In the Nile Valley, agricultural production continued to provide the foundation of Egyptian prosperity, but changing climate patterns and increasing demands for military supplies created pressures that strained traditional farming communities. Egyptian farmers found themselves required to grow new crops for distant markets while also maintaining the grain production that fed the kingdom's expanding population. The morning work in these fields involved careful attention to irrigation schedules and soil conditions that had become more demanding as agricultural techniques evolved to meet imperial requirements. Religious observances throughout the kingdom during this period reflected both continuity with ancient traditions and adaptation to contemporary challenges. In temples from Elephantine to Alexandria, Egyptian priests performed daily rituals that honored the gods while also praying for divine guidance in managing the complex responsibilities of imperial rule. The sacred texts recited during these ceremonies included ancient formulas about Pharaoh's obligations to maintain cosmic order, alongside newer prayers for the safety of Egyptian armies in distant lands. Commercial activity in Alexandria's markets revealed the remarkable diversity of an empire that connected the Mediterranean with the Indian Ocean, but also demonstrated growing competition from rival trading centers that challenged Egyptian commercial dominance. The morning negotiations between Egyptian merchants and foreign traders involved increasingly complex arrangements as other kingdoms developed their own trade networks that bypassed traditional Egyptian routes. Syrian ports, Persian Gulf terminals, and Red Sea trading posts that had once depended entirely on Egyptian shipping now maintained independent commercial relationships that reduced their dependence on Ptolemaic control. The royal workshops where Egyptian craftsmen created the luxury goods that proclaimed Ptoic sophistication faced new challenges as foreign artisans in conquered territories developed competing products that sometimes surpassed traditional Egyptian standards. In the morning sessions where master craftsmen taught their techniques to apprentices, discussions increasingly focused on innovation and adaptation rather than the preservation of traditional methods that had sustained Egyptian artistic supremacy for generations. Educational institutions throughout the kingdom struggled to prepare students for careers in an empire where cultural diversity created both opportunities and obstacles that previous generations had never encountered. Young Egyptians learning Greek language and customs found themselves competing with native Greek speakers for positions in the royal bureaucracy, while Greek settlers studying Egyptian traditions discovered that local populations often preferred to deal with officials who demonstrated genuine understanding of indigenous cultures, rather than superficial familiarity with foreign customs. The administrative burden of governing such a diverse empire required innovations in communication and record-keeping that pushed the limits of ancient technology. In the palace archives, scribes developed new systems for organizing correspondence that arrived in multiple languages and addressed issues ranging from tax collection in Syrian villages to diplomatic negotiations with Arabian tribal chiefs. The daily processing of information required teams of translators and cultural interpreters who could explain not just the literal meaning of messages, but also their implications within specific local contexts. Legal affairs throughout the kingdom became increasingly complex as different populations maintained their traditional legal systems while also acknowledging Ptolemaic royal authority. Egyptian courts in Memphis applied Pharaonic law that had evolved over millennia, while Greek tribunals in Alexandria followed Macedonian legal precedents that emphasized different principles of justice and social organization. The morning sessions in these various legal institutions often addressed disputes that involved parties from multiple cultural backgrounds, requiring judges to navigate between competing legal traditions while maintaining the appearance of impartial justice. Provincial administration revealed the enormous challenges involved in maintaining effective governance across territories that encompass deserts, mountains, river valleys, and coastal plains inhabited by populations with fundamentally different economic activities and social structures. A typical day for a Ptolemaic governor in Syria might begin with mediating conflicts between nomadic herders and settled farmers, continue with negotiations regarding tribute payments from merchant cities, and conclude with military planning sessions addressing threats from neighboring kingdoms that challenged Egyptian control. The evening ceremonies in Alexandria's temples during Ptolemy IV's reign included prayers that reflected both gratitude for the empire's continued prosperity and growing concern about the sustainability of the complex system that his predecessors had created. Egyptian priests who had once celebrated Pharaoh's victories in distant lands now offered requests for divine wisdom in managing the internal challenges that threatened to undermine the cultural synthesis that had made Ptolemaic rule successful. Foreign policy during this period required constant attention to shifting alliances and emerging threats that reflected the changing balance of power in the Mediterranean world. Roman expansion in the Western Mediterranean created new pressures on Ptolemaic territories, while Seleucid recovery in the east threatened Egyptian control over Syrian territories that provided crucial revenue and strategic advantages. The daily diplomatic correspondence that reached Alexandria revealed increasingly complex international situation that would require all of Egypt's resources and diplomatic skills to navigate successfully. The artistic achievements of Ptolemy I's court reflected both the continued vitality of Egyptian creative traditions and growing influences from the diverse cultures that comprise the Ptolemaic Empire. Royal commissions during this period included monuments that celebrated Egyptian pharaonic traditions alongside Greek architectural innovations, while incorporating decorative elements from Syrian, Persian, and Nubian artistic traditions that created uniquely cosmopolitan aesthetic expressions. Yet beneath these magnificent cultural achievements, careful observers could detect signs of the internal tensions that would eventually challenge the dynasty's ability to maintain its remarkable synthesis of diverse traditions and competing interests. The morning routines of palace officials revealed growing difficulties in coordinating policies across territories that presented increasingly divergent challenges. While the evening discussions among royal advisors reflected deepening concerns about the long-term sustainability of an empire that had perhaps expanded beyond the limits of effective ancient administration. The legacy that Ptolemy IV would pass to his successors included not just the territorial and cultural achievements of his predecessors, but also the unresolved tensions and emerging challenges that would test the dynasty's survival in an increasingly competitive and dangerous world. The teenager who had once walked the dusty road to Memphis with dreams of establishing a lasting dynasty had created something far more magnificent than he could have imagined, but also more fragile than his early successes had suggested possible. As the lighthouse of Alexandria swept its beam across waters that carried ships from every corner of the known world, the light illuminated both the remarkable achievements of 3 generations of Ptolemaic rule and the gathering storms that would soon test whether this extraordinary dynasty could adapt to challenges that would require even greater wisdom and innovation than their ancestors had demonstrated in creating the greatest kingdom of the ancient Mediterranean world. The death of Ptolemy IV in 204 BC unleashed forces that would transform the nature of Ptolemaic rule in ways that even the dynasty's enemies could not have anticipated. As news of the